Thank you, Rachel. Thanks everyone for joining us this lunchtime. Lovely to see some former colleagues, current colleagues, and um, members of the public as well taking part in this. So as Rachel said, this exhibition Dislocations that will open in October was really developed directly in response to Old Ways, New Roads, to the material that the curators shared with me about that show and with the histories that it represents. So I know you've been probably attending quite a lot of talks about Old Ways, New Roads over the past while. It'll be familiar to you in its themes and its content, but as a very quick recap, the show developed by my colleague John Bonehill, Nigel Leask, and by Andrew Lau for the Hunterian, looks at different representations of Scotland, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, representations that might have been cartographic in nature, about mapping Scotland, that might be inspired by military undertakings to conquer and contain and rule the land, that might have been touristic, developing it as a romantic site for pleasure and leisure. And so Old Ways, New Roads identifies this really formative set of representations and brings them together. And although that exhibition isn't taking place in the physical realm, it is represented in a wonderful publication and on our website that will share that research. So Dislocation still is very much a kind of little brother or something in relation to that. It's a kind of family member, albeit more modest in scale. So what I wanted to do with Dislocations really was take some of the themes of Old Ways, New Roads as cues to look at where we end up in the present day. And to do that, obviously, we have to take cognizance of the fact that's a leap of a couple of 100 years, and some important things happen both politically and historically in how landscape is understood, and also artistically in the techniques that artists use to represent landscape. So to kind of manage this leap from the 18th and 19th centuries to the 21st, there are a range of early 20th century pieces from the Hunterian collection that are included. For example, Paul Nash, this amazing lithograph showing the kind of blasted apocalyptic landscapes of the First World War in Europe. So landscape as romantic, landscape as a place of leisure and escape is transformed by, for example, the realities of mass mobilization and industrial warfare in the early 20th century. That's one of the things I think that will shape contemporary artists' approaches to it, just one. There's also the rise of a kind of critical perspective on what land is and who it's for. I think that's very much a theme that runs through Old Ways, New Roads, but we could bring it up to date looking at these, for example, these are not included in the exhibition, but they're kind of in the background of it somehow. These two different ways of representing who owns the land of Scotland. So one showing in that kind of purple color on the left there, the largest privately owned estates, including some owned by NGOs in Scotland, and then a map produced by the Scottish Government report in 2014 on land reform, showing the tiny proportion of Scotland in those colours there that are owned by various NGOs. So who is land owned by, and how is that kind of relationship of ownership represented, is one important thematic in Dislocations too. So changes, art historical and political, and questions, I guess, that are asked about it. And this is where the contemporary works that we're going to show come in. I'm not going to show you everything, partly because that's too much of a spoiler, I think. Hopefully you'll be able to see the show in person in October, but also just to make it a more manageable length of presentation. But one key perspective that we're bringing into the exhibition is a poetic one. So Thomas A. Clarke is a renowned poet, but he's also made some visual representations of his poetic thinking, for example, in this print, The Hidden Place from 2010, which very simply displaces existing place names and has translations of their historical names, so often Gaelic names, or names that have the literal meaning of which has been lost over time. So we end up with an image of Scotland not named after people or after particular historical events, but these much more evocative terms: the stepping stones, bright water, forest glade, hut by the pool, little pool in the woods, and so on. So recovering a kind of relationship to place that is indigenous to those sites and poetic rather than, and proprietorial rather than claiming ownership over them. The Glasgow-based painter Louise Hopkins has made some new work for the exhibition. We're also showing some existing works. Louise came to prominence for very meticulously made over paintings and over drawings of maps and other representations. In recent years, she's been working in a much kind of faster way using found material. And here you can see she takes a magazine advert page and produces a kind of collage, partly painting out details, painting others in, showing land being snipped up into little segments, something perhaps inspired by events taking place in 2016. It was a notable referendum, of course. But also taking a surface, the page of a piece of paper as a kind of landscape in this work, on and of, drawing lines around everything except for a certain selection of words on a book page, so that a landscape can become relatively kind of abstract, doesn't represent a literal location, but becomes a set of marks, a scheme of marks that could be used to transform an existing piece of printed matter. And again, those artistic transformations and changes over time are traced in the show, particularly the rise of abstraction as a way of representing place. So this is a wonderful small work by the American color field painter Helen Frankenthaler that's in the Hunterian collection. It's called Winter Map, a very on-the-nose title for Frankenthaler, whose work normally was more poetically titled than that. But I really like the idea of this as sort of a map that isn't literally of a place at all. It's really a map of its own construction of how the paint stained the canvas when Frankenthaler, using thinners, allowed it to run on the canvas. And bringing that up to date, we're going to show some works by the Berlin-based artist Jessica Warboys. Jessica lives between Suffolk and Berlin, and she is known for a working process, which you see illustrated here, in which she takes her canvases down to the shoreline and mixes pigment on them, and then allows the sea to distribute the paint on the canvas. So they're paintings made by the place in which they're shown. They don't represent it in a kind of pictorial way, but through the actions of the elements around them. So we're showing some works made on the east coast of Scotland by Jessica in 2016. And coming back to those questions of politics and land ownership, there will also be some photographs by Faye Godwin, who's a renowned British photographer who made a number of amazing book works. I think she described the book really as her favourite form. And she collaborated with the poet Ted Hughes on some, but also made some that were primarily just image-based. They included several in Scotland, and she was the first female president of the Ramblers Association. She was very interested in rights of access and rights of way, and often photographed historical landscapes, old ways, as it were, that had been blocked or divided or reconfigured by modern ownership and restrictions on access. She also shows these old sites like the Stones of Stennis in their current agricultural uses, again, picking up on some of the histories that Old Ways, New Roads represents. And this is a really key image for the exhibition. For me, it's not taken in Scotland. Not all the works in the show are made in Scotland necessarily, but it relates again to these questions of land ownership, this sort of completely pointless and somewhat dispiriting kind of sign on the Duke of Westminster's estate in the Forest of Bowland, in which this expanse of moorland has a little sign on it declaring that it's private. So Godwin is somebody who used her camera to kind of record how these places functioned in terms of access and ownership is key to the exhibition too. Bringing things a little bit closer to the present day, we're showing a film by the Turner Prize winning artist Charlotte Prodger, who lives and works in Glasgow. Charlotte's film LHB describes, using iPhone camera footage, her journeys made between Berwick-upon-Tweed and Glasgow when she was producing the film. And it uses the Northumbrian flag as a kind of grid device to allow different places to be spliced together in the same frame. And the film has a narration that relates to Charlotte's experience of following bloggers who were walking a different landscape, the Pacific Crest Trail on the northwest coast of America. So she's connecting these two places through digital technology, through her imagining of other bodies and other places, and thinking about that specifically through a queer perspective, which is the hallmark of Charlotte's work in recent years, trying to think about particular forms of subjectivity and how they're represented. So thinking about the natural world in relation to those much more subjective and personal themes. Similarly, connected to questions of identity, the film by Jade Montserrat and her cinematic collaborator, Caitlin Webb Ellis, which shows her walking on a Yorkshire peat bog. It uses drone footage to record her presence in the site, and it's thinking about, again, questions of who these landscapes belong to and how they've been represented. Jade's very much interested in the way that the writing of the Brontes, for example, defines some of these landscapes, but there are particular constructions of racial identity in that work that she contests and questions from her own perspective. So film works about what it means to be in a place or belong to a place. And similarly in this film, which we'll include in the show, Andy Goldsworthy's Hedge Crawl, the sense of the artist's preoccupation not being to stand outside a landscape and represent it, but to be within the landscape. And so in this work, as the sun comes up in the background, we see the artist swimming, as he describes it, through this hedge with great effort and not inconsiderable discomfort to himself, I understand, but a very beautiful image of somebody whose body is no longer understood to kind of master the landscape or stand outside it, to own it or control it, but to be part of it. And some of these contemporary works will be accompanied by historical ones that have a certain direct relationship to them. So Jade Montserrat's Peat Bog film will be shown next to this Turner print of a peat bog in a Scarborough landscape. And then coming to the end of the list of works I'm going to talk to you about, there's a new piece that's been made, or a series of pieces made by collaborative duo Minty Donald and Nick Miller, who've been visiting various sites of extractive landscapes in Scotland. So here, landscape as something that's owned and used, but also as a natural resource that's commodified, that's turned into stuff to be sold. And so they're visiting these sites and making casts using the materials that are extracted there. So materials such as coal, sand, water, and so on. And they've been inviting, when lockdown conditions have allowed, staff at these sites who do the extraction to hold the material in their cupped hands like this, mixed with a casting resin, and producing both positive and negative forms. So forms that show the shape made by the hands, and these more abstract forms made by the material that's held there, making these huge processes of extraction and value making out of the landscape, the turning of the landscape into commodities, into something tangible, physical, and relatable. Something, these kinds of extractive industries take place on a vast scale, and Minty and Nick have brought it into a kind of intimate human scale, but with all those questions about ecology and how we use land implicit in it. And these objects will be shown in the gallery and then in the Hunterian's sculpture courtyard, we'll show some of the raw material, the extracted material from these sites. And then finally, I think in this presentation, a film that we acquired this summer through a gift by the Contemporary Art Society, the New York-born, Glasgow-based artist Margaret Salmon's film Eglantine, which she describes as a nature film for children. And to have one note of straightforwardly kind of beautiful and optimistic relationship to nature and landscape in the show, I think it was important to include this film. The artist uses her own 3 children as the protagonists, and her middle child, Eglantine, of the title, has a kind of nighttime adventure in the Scottish landscape, meeting animals, some other humans. It's a kind of beautiful portrait of discovery and wonder at the natural world. So we kind of bring things back to the possibility of relating to nature in a form that relates to pleasure, if not to ownership and control, as in many of the leisure images of Old Ways, New Roads. Maybe I should end with this image because it seems to represent that very well, I think. So it's a show that works in lots of different mediums. There's painting, print, sculpture, film, text, and I hope it will provide some food for thought for people as they move between the Old Ways, New Roads material online and this in the gallery. Obviously, when we'd conceived these things, we'd thought of them as happening both physically together, and I think that would still have been the best outcome possibly. But nonetheless, I think the works in the show should stand alone really, and I hope you'll all come see the show and enjoy them.